Hello everyone, my name is Becca Austin and I will be analyzing Cynthia Fordham's research on the phenomenon called acting white, and I will also present how this affects students in today's society. So what is acting white? Acting white is the concept in which a member from a minority group, specifically in this presentation we'll be talking about the African American population, is influenced and changed by traditionally white practices in culture, academics, politics, etc. It is important to note that this is not cultural assimilation, but rather that this is a product of cultural assimilation. So a few issues that we will be talking about surrounding acting white is the burden of acting white versus the fear of acting white, identity theft and self-identity, gender-specific racial performances in males versus females, and the academic performance of African American students compared to those of white American students. These four issues were touched on by Cynthia Fordham, which is where I'm getting my research from. And so the burden of acting white versus the fear of acting white. Acting white is the embodiment of what the U.S. culture has historically defined as success and quintessentially American. Significantly, what the culture defines as success and as the U.S. identity continues to be the prerogative of those who are white as well as male. To put it bluntly, white and whiteness are synonyms for power. This is from Beyond Capitol High on Dual Citizenship and Strange Career of Acting White by Cynthia Fordham, where I get all of this research. Beyond Capitol High is a experiment that he did in a high school, and that is where all of these results are from. So next we will go into the history, what it's like today, and the implications of that history and on today. So, for African American students, it means unconditionally embracing the institutions and practices that were treated as the prerogative of white Americans and declared off limits to enslaved Africans and their descendants. The burden of acting white is a product of the years of white supremacy implemented through slavery and racism. America was entirely built catering to the white population, who were at the time of colonization had the advantage. And in order for these Black Americans to fit in, they were forced into the burden of acting white to achieve success in such a European-dominated society. So one figure which we'll talk about a few times throughout this presentation is Rosa Parks, because she provides an example of this burden of acting white when she refused to move from the front of the bus to the back. She displayed a sense of first-class entitlement that was traditionally only applied to white Americans. So throughout history, any of these protests, like Malcolm X protests or MLK, those are all forms of acting white, because it is that displaying a sense of first-class entitlement, which everyone deserves, but not everyone gets. So today, acting white is a scripted, even racialized performance, the goal of which is perhaps unconsciously something approximating attempted identity theft. So the version of acting white today is a sort of change in identity. After years of racial history placing Europe Americans at the top of the social hierarchy, it has led to the general theme of like an all-traditional white America. In order to fit in with that society, often most, especially African Americans, must adopt a lot of those practices and disregard a lot of their own racial heritage, or it would get lost within time. This phenomenon is what we see today as a sort of identity crisis within the Black community, where acculturation of American lifestyle has altered their way of life. So burden versus fear. Burden, which suggests having to carry a heavy load, is free of the emotional dimension that fear implies. Burden suggests suffering, with or without fear. Fear indicates anxiety, but is often disconnected from suffering. So Rosa Parks faced in the moment when she protested on the bus an encrypting sense of fear when she refused to give up her seat. Though she was brave, and most argue in this case fearless, this form of acting white is not necessarily the burden of acting white, because the burden of acting white would be something that Rosa Parks would face on a daily basis, along with many other African Americans, but specifically in this case, where she protested, it presents itself as anxiety as opposed to a burden. So that would be the fear of acting white. So implications of this phenomenon, which we'll discuss throughout the presentation, is a loss of minority cultures and traditional practices, identity crisis among minority groups, negative opinions and judgment of traditionally African American culture, and not to mention the implication that to be successful, one must neglect their own personal background and adopt the identity of someone completely different, which we will speak about now in Identity Theft and Self-Identity. And revisiting what it means to cope with the burden of acting white, I seek to explicate how the official and unofficial expectation that Black youth and other youth of color perform what is imagined as whiteness both in and outside the school context is simultaneously resisted and paradoxically embraced. So we'll talk about losing one's own identity and adopting that new one. So the article starts with a story describing a boy who experiences this sense of identity loss when his white peers accuse him of not acting Black enough. Sam, the boy's name, who returned from school, concerned his parents, who immediately thought he had maybe had a physical altercation, but when questioned, he explained that the white classmates had decided upon themselves, based on Sam's behavior and attitude, that he possessed traits which fit closer to white culture than Black. Thus, he was acting white. Sam experienced something that many African Americans go through, where they are judged based on the lack of traditional heritage and ancestry as a result of extreme acculturation in America. Comments such as these are ignorant to the concept of assimilation and can be very troubling to a student who may already struggle with understanding their past and racial history. So, adopting a new identity. Along with the struggle of identity loss, there comes the struggle of adopting a new culture. America, as we can tell from history, was built in order to benefit white Americans. And so in order to become successful in this country, minorities are then forced to give up their own culture, linguistics, economics, morals, religions, etc., and instead practice that of a Euro-American population. And this phenomenon leads to a trend where people don't feel as though they can fit into a specific identity. Either they've been told that they're not acting Black enough to fit in with the African American population, or they don't fit in enough with the white American population. And so that's when people start to feel a sense of loss and not understanding where exactly they fit in and how they're supposed to be acting and what they should be doing, which is a huge issue for lots of people across America. So I have my own personal little experience. My half-sister, Brittany, who shares my mother with me, however, her father is African American, her biological father. This makes her half Black, and living with her for years, she's made many comments about not feeling like she fits in. Although my parents did everything they could to ensure her that she belonged, she would consistently get comments from peers and even sometimes adults stating that she looked Black but did not act it. So this created that sense that I was just talking about of she looked Black, so she felt like she should be able to identify with the African American community, but she couldn't because she didn't act like it according to other people. But then when she tried to claim that she fits closer in with the white culture, then that also didn't reign true because, well, she didn't. She had her own specific slang terms that she would use. She had her own morals. She had her own culture. And so that came from her biological father. And so I could see that happening through her. So gender-specific racial performance. This is interesting. So Black males in sports. Black males, specifically in high school, are targeted for recruitment in sports as they represent what America views as peak masculinity. In turn, white males are left to continue high academic performances, ignoring the academia gap between races, which we'll talk about later. Being celebrated as this star athlete ensures that they are rewarded for their athletic ability and more importantly, so that they are not competing with white academics. So that is another huge thing for the academia gap, is targeting Black males for sports as opposed to academics. So insufficiently male versus insufficiently Black. Because children who identify as Black and male are widely represented primarily as Black rather than as male because of race functions as the master status, they are often denied access to the reigning hegemonic notion that boys will be boys. Which I don't like the phrase boys will be boys, but if it's going to apply to anyone, then it definitely should not only apply to white boys, because they already have all the privilege. They don't need the boys will be boys phrase. When experimented, students were asked to choose between whether they identified as Black or male. Most of the overachieving students responded male, likely due to the academic stereotype along with Black. However, the underachieving students overwhelmingly chose Black, which was interesting. So for Black females, they have a huge issue fitting in with society here in white America, as Black women are raised to be assertive and demanding of respect, which is instilled from a young age. This respect is often just granted to white women. But upon Black women, this is a very important matter that they, after years of civil unrest, that they do demand this respect. However, this has now led to the stereotype that Black women or girls are loud or out of place, which is not the case, of course. And white educators who are accustomed to the compliance in young girls, Black girls are raised in a manner to speak up for themselves, which often wrongly gets translated to loud. This means those who conform to this typically white behavior are rewarded with good grades completely unfairly. So that is actually, I work in Athens Clarke County elementary school, and I see this all the time. It upsets me so much. Anyways, academic performances of African American students. It was based on the concept of race as a forced performance on the part of African American students, or admit that the structural limitations based on race that are still an endemic feature of U.S. public and private life make Black youth's oppositional culture a reasonable response to their Black prospects. So racism within testing, as you can see with this chart, there's no question that testing gaps between minority groups and white Americans are a product of racial bias. Standardized tests in America have been geared towards the white population for years, using white slang, white pronunciation, white cultural relevance. And understanding the results on the graph, it is clear that, of course, Black Americans score significantly lower than white Americans because of this bias in the standardized testing. This assumption of mass acculturation of all races and ethnicities to be accustomed to Euro-American culture has resulted in these unfair testing conditions. Not to mention the conceptions of African American motivation, false stereotypes picturing African Americans to have a lack of motivation and work ethic in comparison to white students, which is completely false. But that is due to people like, hold on, let me find it. I can't find who it was, but it's due to this perception of parenting. Due to America's systemically racist economy, many low socioeconomic income areas can be largely populated with African Americans. In low socioeconomic income areas, obviously parents must work more and in change cannot support their child in the way that they like to. This has now translated by racist means into African American parents being accused of poor tactics to raising their children. The white population in this same area will have the same phenomenon applied to them, however, no one will make note of it. Bill Cosby, that's what I was trying to get to. Bill Cosby, he made comments on the parenting and child bearing practices of African Americans, which gave them a very negative stereotype and stigma. And how does this connect to acting white? Many supporters of this concept of poor parenting in the African American community will argue that white parenting tactics may prove more successful for their children, which is no proof for that. African Americans who are accused of acting white are inevitably displaced, becoming conscripts in the army of one, perceived as matter out of place. Every American of African ancestry who opts to perform whiteness, even episodically, is forced to fight to retain citizenship in the Black community while concurrently seeking acceptance of the hegemonic white society. Thank you so much for watching, and here are our discussion questions.